Good evening, everybody. My name is Vijay Gurbaksani. I'm the director of the Center for Digital Transformation here at the University of California, Irvine. Welcome to the launch of our programming in the 2022-2023 academic year. We're delighted you could all be here with us today. I'm especially excited because it is the launch of our 11th year as the Center for Digital Transformation. So we have survived and thrived over the last 10 years, including during the pandemic. So thank you all for your continued support, and thank you all for joining us. So welcome, everybody. Let me just say a couple of words about what we try to do with the Digital Leadership Series. So a lot of our programming has to do with sort of the managerial and leadership implications of digital technologies. What we try to do with the Digital Leadership Series is take a broader societal and macroeconomic perspective as they relate to sort of the digital economy, how digital influences the economy and society, and in the reverse direction as well. With that, we thought a wonderful way to start this new year, our 11th year, is to talk about what has changed in the last decade around sort of the world we live in, especially the cyberspace world. And so if you think back to 2012 when we launched, I remember the opening talk I gave for our center. It used a line: if social media can democratize a country, you better believe it can democratize your company. And we were very focused on sort of the business perspective. And fast forward 10 years, and many things have played out as we hoped they would, but a lot of things have not played out the way we wanted. And some of our positive aspirations for the internet haven't really haven't become real. So I couldn't think of two better people to invite to speak today than Nicole Perlroth and Adam Siegel, who are going to talk about the new report they worked on for the Council on Foreign Relations. It's called Confronting Reality in Cyberspace: Foreign Policy for a Fragmented Internet. Adam is the Ira Lipman Chair in Emerging Technologies and National Security and Director of the Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His full bio is on our website and in the slides. Nicole Perlroth has spoken to us before about her wonderful book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, which went on to win the McKinsey Financial Times Award for the Best Business Book of the Year. She's now an advisor to CISO and is an advisor to many cybersecurity startups as well, and as she puts it, cyber raconteur. So with that, welcome Nicole and Adam. I'm delighted to host you today. I'm so pleased you could join us. Just a couple of rules of the game. We disable the chat function. Your questions will be via the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar. And the format will be, I'm going to turn it over to Adam. Adam's going to turn it over to Nicole. I will talk to the two of them with a Q&A format for probably 7 or so minutes. And then we'll turn it over to all of you to share your questions with us. With that, thank you again. And Adam, take it away.
Thanks very much, Vijay, and thanks for having us on to talk about the report. And in many ways, the history of the report mirrors the kind of optimism and timeline that you introduced. The Council actually did its first task force on US foreign policy towards cyberspace in 2012, 2013. And comparing that report to this report, the optimism about the internet and the optimism about what the US could accomplish in the internet is quite notable. The purpose of that first report was really to try and introduce many of the ideas about the foreign policy implications of cyberspace were to the kind of traditional foreign policy thinkers who weren't familiar with the challenges of the internet yet. And the report, probably half the report is embracing the democratic, social, and economic potential of the internet, all of which in many ways has come to fruition. But the more recent report is really focused on a lot of the downsides and a lot of the negatives that have really come to forward in the last decade. The report really, I think, has two main headlines. The first one was teased on your slides, which is that, you know, over the last 10 years, looking at all measures of internet freedom, data flows, and internet shutdowns, what we've seen is a the global platform has become increasingly fragmented, that nation states are asserting their sovereignty and their government authority over the internet. They are blocking content. They are requiring that certain types of data be stored locally. They are increasingly worried about who's producing the hardware that they are using, where that hardware comes from. And so the internet today is less free than it was um, before, and is going to be even less free tomorrow. So we're basically beginning to see that. And so the report calls for essentially acknowledging that reality. The US for the last 30 years in its internet policy has said that our aspiration is a global open internet, and we should be trying to work that. And the report essentially says, look, we're not going to convince Russia, China, and other countries to change their way. What we should try to do is build the largest coalition possible for the trusted flow of data, but we're not going to essentially be able to turn the tide on China, Russia, and others. The second main finding has to do about the growing nature of the risks and how US strategy so far has really failed to address most of the growing threats of cyber attacks in this space. The vast majority of these attacks are espionage. Increasingly, we see disruptive attacks. We've seen very, very few destructive attacks, but the potential for that is rising. We are seeing the rise of ransomware as a national security threat. But the US's strategy of trying to create norms of behavior in cyberspace for states, for calling out actors, for attributing the attacks to China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, particularly for indicting the individual hackers, really hasn't worked. It has not stopped the constant drumbeat of those attacks. And so the report calls for both disrupting those attacks through what is called defending forward, greater transparency about US actions on the offensive side, as well as some limits on the types of actions that the US itself is going to conduct around certain types of attacks. So some norms of self-restraint as the US becomes more offensively oriented. I'll just briefly, before I turn it over to Nicole, just say that the policy recommendations fall under three categories, falling from those main two conclusions. The first is, how do we build that alliance of countries that have a similar view about how we should operate in cyberspace? So how do we build the trusted flow of data among the most countries possible? How do we defend ourselves? So how do we build the strategy of disruption and sanctions? And then finally, how do we get our house in order? What do we need to do domestically to position the US for foreign policy?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, Adam laid that out rather beautifully, and he was the author of this report. And I should state up front that I came into this project a little bit late, so I missed some of the initial discussions, but I have to say that as someone who covered this space for the last 12 years, it was such a relief to see an organization like the Council on Foreign Relations say, hey, let's meet, let's create recommendations for a foreign policy that meets the internet age where it actually is and accepts our current digital reality. Because we all remember to some extent Hillary Clinton's vision for a free and open internet that she articulated some 10 years ago. And there was this idea that the US was putting out there that, hey, this is how it's going to be. And if you do not participate, you're going to miss out on the benefits of the digital age. And what we have seen over the last decade plus is that that is not true. Countries like China have figured out how to use the internet for their authoritarian advantage with the Great Firewall. We've seen Iran essentially create its own internet. We're starting to see that with Russia. And, the one through line I can say I saw in my front row seat at the New York Times was that we were starting to see countries not only wake up to the potential of the internet for espionage, but increasingly for destruction. Or the Iranian attacks on Saudi Aramco, this North Korea's attacks on Sony Pictures, Iran's attack on Sands Casino, and then increasingly these ransomware attacks, in some cases that were directly state-sponsored, like the North Korean attack, the WannaCry attack in 2017, and later the NotPetya attack by Russia against Ukraine that boomeranged around the world. And so what this report does, it says, listen, we can only nudge our adversaries so much. And, some of these ad hoc things that we have tried in the past, like naming and shaming and indictments of, say, Chinese PLA hackers and the occasional sanction, haven't really moved the needle much. And so we are now at an inflection point, and it is critical that we basically regroup with allies to create a coalition of like-minded governments, and that the right way to do this is not around some vague notion of democracy that some countries may disagree with, or they may call us hypocritical after some of the Snowden revelations, for instance. And so we need something meaty to come together on. And so some of the recommendations in the report, and I really encourage everyone to read it line for line, because it is a meaty body of work. It is not an academic white paper. It's not something that's going to collect dust on someone's shelves. It is very substantive. And I think what it says is, listen, we need to find a way to come together with our allies. And there are certain areas where we have weak standing, such as GDPR. We've really let Europe take the ball and lead on privacy regulation and privacy policy. And GDPR is not perfect. It didn't paralyze things as some people predicted, but it basically, most people's idea of what GDPR became in practical terms was just that pop-up that annoyingly asks you if you want to accept all the cookies on various websites. And so the report basically says, listen, the US can't afford to not take a position here. And we need to actually maybe exploit the fact that GDPR has had these problems and take a leadership position, and that we need to take a stand on digital trade agreements and other things where we can come together in sort of the technical equivalent of what we've now done in Ukraine, where we've been able to come together with allies against Russia and implement sanctions and really punish Russia for the invasion. In the same way, this report says, we really need to come together, and we need to come up with certain standards and norms, and we need to push back and punish countries like Russia, for instance, that provide safe harbor to cyber criminals. It also identifies efforts that have played out in a very ad hoc way over the last decade that worked, but there was really no funding or formalization of these efforts, such as the botnet that several countries and some companies participated in taking down, which was called the Game Over Zeus botnet a few years ago. And the report says that was a great effort, but it was very ad hoc. And we need to essentially create something like an international cyber crime center where we formalize those efforts and that collaboration so that we can do this on an ongoing basis, so that we're not just reconvening every time there's some major attack or botnet or cyber criminal endeavor. We need to sort of come together and formalize these efforts, and that there are already organizations out there like Interpol that could provide some best practices. But the other thing is this report is a little provocative in saying that it's time to, in some ways, be very open about some of the offensive actions that we have already taken in cyber in terms of disrupting our adversaries, and really, carrying a big stick in this domain and being very clear about what the US won't do. And we say in the report, the US should say that it is not going to attack election infrastructure, for instance, or the global financial system. But we should be very clear that we are prepared to act and be very transparent about what those actions might look like against governments that violate those norms, or that even provide safe harbor to cyber criminals who conduct sabotage type attacks. So we can go into the specifics. I'm sure you have many questions. I'll probably stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Adam. So a couple of things. First, I was remiss in not acknowledging the Beal Family Foundation and KPMG, who sponsored this series and make it possible for all of us to attend at no cost. And I forgot, I don't think I mentioned Nicole actually worked at the New York Times for a decade. That was my bad. Rusty over this summer. But, I want to unpack this report because so for background, I reached out to Nicole, who's a friend, and said, I read this and I think it's fantastic. And I would love to present this to sort of this Center for Digital Transformation community because, we are primarily a business school community, though, we're anchored in the business school, but a lot of our community is broader than that, of course. But, I want to start, and for us, our goal at the business school is to develop leaders for a digitally driven world. And oftentimes it's focused on what do we do around strategy, around technology, and so on. But you're sort of completely upending the context in which we do business in some way. So I've heard this even in a different context around supply chains, where we are disassociated. China, for example, a lot of companies are unpacking their supply chains away from China and so on. But you make some bold assertions. The era of the global internet is over. That's your first statement. Our policies promoting an open global internet have failed. But then you shift to acknowledging sort of some things that I think we've been talking about from a business perspective, but you're elevating it in sort of because that's the world, particularly Adam, I think belongs to. Data is a source of geopolitical power and competition, and we've taken ourselves out of the game on digital trade. Walk me through those. Like, how did you come up with those conclusions? Like, we all wish there wasn't some of these things weren't true, but they are. And so, how do you come to those conclusions?
I think as Nicole reminded us, right? Secretary Clinton gave a series of speeches in 2010 and 2011 that laid out this vision of a global platform that the U.S. would continue to push for. We would put pressure on countries that were censoring the internet and keeping U.S. firms off. We would develop technologies that would help users get around censorship, anti-circumvention technology, and that we would be engaged in the struggle to ensure this global platform. And I think the realization the task force came to was that not only had that in many ways failed because we really have had no influence on what China does or what Russia does, but more and more countries see that model as having important things that they can borrow from. More and more countries think, oh, of course we're going to regulate the internet. Of course we're going to control certain types of data flow. Of course we're going to require companies to do certain things within our jurisdictions, either for economic or legal or national security reasons. And so I think the task force really felt that, look, the aspiration made sense. It was one that was worth fighting for, but we've reached a stage where we have to admit that aspiration will never be achieved. And we have to figure out what it is we can achieve. And as Nicole said, there is a slight hypocrisy that I think we wanted to speak to, that as the US talks about the risks from Chinese platforms like TikTok and Huawei and others, that we are, taking some types of technology and blocking them from the US domestic market. And we want to do that in specific ways. We want to make sure that it's transparent, it's by the rule of law and all these other reasons. But I think a lot of it had to do with it was just time to accept that this reality was here, and how do we best confront it?
Yeah, so, to abbreviate, 20 years ago, whenever it was, we were handing out the book by Tom Friedman on The World is Flat. And I guess now we're saying the world isn't flat. And the realpolitik has sort of entered the equation, which is, would it be fair to say that what is really happening is the reality of geopolitics is unsurprisingly sort of affecting how we think about, digital trade and digital infrastructure, because, it's just the new platform for the economy. So it's just the geopolitical realities coming back to play here, just as they always have in every form of trade.
Yeah, and look, there were certainly skeptics even at the beginning. Tim Wu, who's now in the White House, and Jack Goldsmith, wrote a book in the 2010s, if I remember correctly, basically saying, the internet was going to be, in many ways, sovereign states were going to assert their authority over different parts of the internet, given their economic, national security, and legal issues. So yes, I think we are at this point of where geopolitics, like it has in so many others of trade and economic interchange, have really reasserted themselves. I think, the big pushback that we have received in the report, and both from the White House and from, I would say, the tech and human rights community, is giving up the aspiration.
Yeah.
Right. Many people, when we first released the report and we went to brief people in the NSC and other parts of the U.S. government, said, yeah, this is, we see the same reality that you do, but why should we give up the aspiration? And there was, I think, a very thoughtful critique that was done by two members that had two individuals who had one worked at the Mozilla Foundation, one had worked in the U.S. government on online freedom, and said, by giving up the aspiration for a global platform, we are strengthening China and Russia's arguments. I don't think that's true. I don't think, I really don't think we're doing very much to strengthen. China and Russia don't need us for that argument. They've been making it consistently for the last 20 years. But I think there is, a sense of we can keep the aspiration and do what, many ways the policy recommendations are very similar to what we would suggest.
That's interesting. I'm just going to answer a simple question, which is, somebody wants me to repeat what I said. I just said data is a source of geopolitical power and competition, and is seen as central to economic and national security. So turning back to Adam and Nicole, can we just dig deeper into sort of some of the things that, for example, China and Russia have done? Just sort of give us some flavor of some of the things that they've done to, I don't know what the right word is, but weaken this global internet.
I can take that one, but I'd love to hear Adam's perspective on China. I mean, just to go back for a second, on giving up the aspiration. It's not really that we're giving up the aspiration so much as that we're recognizing that there was a dark side that we didn't properly recognize going into this. And if you just look at social media and the Arab Spring, when the Arab Spring popped up, we said, okay, social media is going to democratize these countries. And it looked like it would go that way for a while. And now, unfortunately, it's gone the other way. Yeah. And we know that in some of these Gulf states, their biggest national security threat as they see it is their own people, is another Arab Spring. And so we see them, trying to plant Saudi spies at Twitter, and trying to, get their people inside the building so they can find out who are these people on these platforms criticizing the monarchy, the ruling party. And so that is the reality that we sort of failed to encapsulate when we started saying social media is going to democratize the world. So that's just an example. Now, China and Russia, what have they done? Well, for one, China sees, China does not want to be the world's manufacturer. They want to be an innovator. And so what is the shortest road to do that? It is stealing Western intellectual property. And so that is really what has happened over the last decade plus, is we've seen China use cyber espionage for industrial trade theft. And then last November, the US government declassified a report that said, in addition to everything they've been doing for cyber espionage for industrial trade benefit, we've also seen Chinese state-sponsored groups hack into pipeline networks, not for intellectual property theft, but to gain a foothold into these networks in case they might want to shut them down in the event of some larger geopolitical conflict. And we've seen the same from Russia. We've seen them probe critical infrastructure. I mean, just what's out there publicly that I covered at the New York Times, we've seen some of these Russian groups probe our nuclear plants here in the United States. We caught them hacking into Wolf Creek, the nuclear plant in Kansas. We've seen a research institute just outside Moscow that was determined to be an arm of the Kremlin, break into a Saudi petrochemical facility and turn the safety locks off. Essentially the last thing you would need to do before you trigger some kind of explosion in what was determined to sort of be a dry run for some future event. We've seen Russia obviously invest in bots and troll armies to try to impact US opinion when it comes to politics. We've seen them pour gasoline essentially on American culture wars in this larger effort to divide us so that we would be distracted by our own politics and unable to pay attention to whatever the Kremlin was doing over there. We've seen them turn the lights off in Ukraine, not once but twice, and we've seen them launch a global act of cyber sabotage, the NotPetya attack, which boomeranged against Ukraine, which boomeranged outside of Ukraine and knocked companies like Merck offline. Created huge existential crises for some of these American companies who are still suffering in some ways as a result and out $500 million in damages and can't get repaid because their insurance company said, sorry, we have a war exemption clause in your policy, and technically you were collateral damage in Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine. So, this report basically says these parties are abusing the internet in some ways and to their national security advantage. And there's only so much we can do to try to cajole them into the light. And there's only so much that this sort of attempt we've made at naming and shaming can do in terms of our indictments of some of these hackers, because none of these people have actually seen the inside of a prison cell. So basically what the report says is, listen, here's the reality. Here's what our adversaries are doing. And if we're not able to nudge or cajole them, then let's pour our resources into where it counts, which is sitting down with like-minded allies and coming up with a list of cyber attacks and consequences that we could use to punish bad actors. And let's make sure that that coalition is stronger than just this vague notion of a free and open internet that we were espousing 10 years ago. But Adam, take it away on China.
I think what we've seen with the Chinese had the original splinter net, right? We all have heard of the term about the Great Firewall, and so from the beginning, the Chinese built a system, both technological and legal, that allowed them to keep outside information out and to rapidly take down information that Chinese users posted that they saw as a threat to domestic stability and regime legitimacy. They did that both through technology and through a massive censorship network that all the companies themselves are responsible for taking the information down. What happened around 2013, 2014, in particular, when Xi Jinping began to take power, was that the Chinese began to think that it wasn't enough just to keep information out, that they also needed to shape the global internet. Mm-hmm. And so we saw both domestic reforms, so new laws inside of China, the cybersecurity law of 2017, the data security law, which required certain types of information be stored locally, required code reviews and other types of inspection. We saw in international discussions the Chinese talking about cyber sovereignty and the need to move discussions about cybersecurity and cyberspace away from what's called the multi-stakeholder model. So the group of technical and private groups that the United States has always sponsored, like the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, and other groups like that, away from the multi-stakeholder model to a multilateral model in the UN. So a more state-centric shape there. And they've been helping the Russians do many of the same things. So providing some of the technologies to filter. The Russians have practiced kind of shutting off the entire Russian internet from the global internet. They have also passed laws about data storage and having local operators as well there.
Just to the audience, if you could start typing in your questions, that would be great, so I can turn it over at some point. Let's move on. So what I'm taking away from this is, are you proposing something like a NATO for digital? Because I was thinking about this as, I'm a technology economist and a computer scientist once upon a time. We talk about network effects, and the size of the network is really important. Obviously, you want it to be economically attractive for people to invest in this and conduct digital trade on these platforms. And so from that point of view, clearly you want as wide a network as you can summon. But you're also talking about sort of defensive actions, setting the rules of the game, when the US will act or respond offensively and defensively, sort of laying out the structure. That to me, and I'm certainly not a foreign policy expert, sounds to me like a NATO, but I could be completely wrong. So what do you think about is that a reasonable, I know you reference the UN, of course. So what's a good reference frame for people for what you're proposing?
So I think a lot of it depends on the issue, right? I don't think we believe there's going to be one organization or one alliance or one framework. I think NATO is not a bad model for on the security side, right? I think NATO already exists on the security side. NATO has acknowledged that a cyber attack could trigger what's called the Article 5 agreement, so that it could be a use of force that the allies have to respond to. NATO is increasingly looking at China and China's operations in cyber and what role it plays there. The US has tried to get some of the smaller countries to play a larger role, as Nicole was saying, in the attribution and the indictment of the hackers. So a country like the Netherlands has taken a more visible role in calling out Russian and Chinese hackers than we've seen before. And I think the US would like to include South Korea and Japan in those partnerships, in calling out North Korean and Chinese. I don't think it has a lot of expectations that it's a country like India would probably get involved on the security side, but I think it has high expectations for a country like India on the digital trade side.
Yes.
And so, as you said, I think on the externality side and the market size, yes, it definitely wants to think about India as a partner, either in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework or other digital trade agreements. And that, I think, would include, they would be, the focus there will be India, Indonesia, other large markets where you could have agreements about data localization, supply chain security, other types of things that common, not necessarily democracies, but at least some expectations about how the data is handled and treated. You could build from there.
We've got a bunch of questions, so I'm going to just start with one from my colleague Ming Dishin, who's, do you think the policies governing digital trade or infrastructure should become similar to the policies governing traditional trade and physical infrastructure? If not, what are the differences? What's different between physical and digital here?
I'm going to let Adam answer that one, but let me just say one more thing about NATO, Vijay, which is, as part of this exercise of putting together this task force report, we interviewed several people in industry and government. And one of the questions I had for, let's just call him a senior military official, because these were on background, was what kind of cyber attack would trigger Article 5 of NATO, where we would have to respond? And the answer was, whatever the commander-in-chief says it is. It's clear that we want to maintain some level of flexibility when it comes to cyber attacks and responding to cyber attacks, that we might not have that same kind of flexibility ingrained in NATO. And I think the report does a pretty good job of restraining itself and allowing for that level of flexibility. I mean, we make one recommendation that says, we should engage our adversaries on rules about whether to, on hacking nuclear systems, for instance. Yes. But we do not make any recommendations specific to hacking the power grid. That is something that, when you just read the news, we don't get specific in the report. But, I, as a New York Times journalist, reported that Cyber Command was hacking the Russian grid and making a pretty loud show of it. And we know that they've been probing our own critical infrastructure systems. And so in some ways, we recognize that this is become sort of a legitimate means of mutually assured digital destruction.
Right.
And so we don't touch that, but we will go as far to make a recommendation when it comes to nuclear.
And that is one of my sort of takeaways, is there is sort of a digital arms race too. But Adam, if you want to go back to the original question of.
Yeah, so it's an extremely interesting, and I think it seems like a very large question, so I'm not sure which way to take it. I'll try to take it two separate ways. So I think both on the international side, I think there are reasons to think of it as separate, partly because the trade negotiations have become so difficult, right? So I think traditionally we have seen some progress. For example, in the Korean-U.S. free trade agreement had a large digital component that's become an important model for. It was used in whatever we're calling NAFTA now, the USMCA, and so and was being built. The TPP was going to have similar components to it. But given that the U.S. is no longer engaged in these trade discussions, right? Because we can't do that because of the domestic debate. I think we are seeing a split, and part of the Biden administration's this Indo-Pacific framework is an attempt to say, okay, we're not going to be able to really talk that much about trade, but we can talk about a lot of the digital issues separately. So we can do things like standards on and supply chains and all these other things. So I think there is a kind of a tension there that's pulling the two apart on the foreign policy on the trade side. Domestically, I think certainly there's been a long argument about do traditional bureaucracies, or certainly in the ones in the U.S., are they up to the challenge of making digital policy, right? I mean, Congress certainly doesn't seem up to the challenge. Given both the kind of lack of knowledge about digital technologies and the bipartisanship that is making it very difficult to move forward. And so I think that's why you see a lot of think tanks have suggested that we recreate the Office of Technology Assessment, or we try to bring some new expertise into the domestic sphere. That said, and this is not just because Nicole is an advisor, but I think CISA and other parts of the government are doing a very good job of reaching out to the private sector, are increasing their cadence about responding to the attacks. We could have a long discussion about is the EU doing the right things in the digital space, but they clearly are moving very quickly on AI and Digital Service Act and the Digital Market Act. So I do think that there's, that argument doesn't hold as much. That there's no reason why the same structures can't deal with digital issues as they deal with other regulatory issues.
You just touched on something that I think is worth emphasizing, because we in business schools, and I really shouldn't speak for everybody, but I tend to do these things, really talk about sort of artificial intelligence as a force for good. I mean, we understand all the limitations around, sort of the biases that it introduces and so on. But in general, we talk about it in terms of productivity improvements and improving science and so on. But sort of your take on it, which is something that I think everybody needs to think about a lot, is these technologies actually can increase strategic instability, as you say in your report. And going back to Nicole's topic of cybersecurity, I mean, we haven't talked enough about sort of quantum and sort of how all the keys, private public key infrastructure that we use will be child's play for quantum computing if the reports are correct, right? So we do have to think about sort of these are turning out to be offensive weapons and defensive weapons as well. So we do have to think about the risks that they introduce. Leo Cruz has a question. Actually, let me go to, I missed one. So one reality that needs to be considered for Britain is when it comes to having a technological edge is that once you use it, you lose it due to the adversary learning how to counter it. So it's important to focus on improving defense rather than revealing offensive capabilities by using them in non-critical situations. What's the panel's opinion? Nicole's shaking her head, so I'm going to turn it over to her.
Snapping an agreement. Yeah. I mean, I think, and this is not in the report, but it's something I've said in my book and speaking tours is I still believe that the United States is the top dog when it comes to cyber offense. No one has pulled off another Stuxnet, but they're getting closer. And the fact that we are the world's #1 player when it comes to cyber offense, unfortunately, has not done much to improve our defensive situation. We are now among the most targeted nations in the world when it comes to destructive cyber attacks and cyber espionage, because this is still where much of the value is. And so my personal recommendation has been, it's time to make cyber defense the priority. That is why I left the New York Times to join CISA. This report essentially makes the same recommendation. I mean, it doesn't go into the, if you use it, you lose it, but clearly there's been some restraint from the United States to really use our offensive capabilities to max, for fear of basically losing those capabilities. And what the report says is, yes, once you start using these offensive capabilities, you leave yourself vulnerable, right? The old don't throw stones from glass houses. We are the ultimate glass house because we are so digitized. 85% of our critical infrastructure is in private sector hands. The government has very little visibility into those systems. We basically have to plea and beg private companies to meet basic cyber hygiene standards. So we are very, very vulnerable. And what the report says is, yes, it is time to clean up US cyberspace. And we make some very specific recommendations about those. We need, ISPs have few incentives to clean up traffic. We need to make sure that we reverse that. We need to, enforce know your customer requirements much more strictly. We need to find a way to address the domestic intelligence gap. The fact that most of these attacks happen on private sector systems, but the government has very little insight into these systems. Until now, we've said, okay, well, maybe if we just do this defend forward policy, maybe if we hack our adversaries and we gain an early insight into what they're up to, we will be able to stop attacks before they come here. Well, after SolarWinds, we know that just doesn't work very well. When our adversaries are staging attacks from servers in New Jersey and using an American Texas software company as a Trojan horse to break into our best and brightest corporations and government agencies, and the NSA doesn't catch it, clearly something is backwards there. And we even go and make very specific recommendations about zero-day policy, which is a topic near and dear to my heart. But, forever, it's no longer a secret that the United States and some of our Five Eyes allies have kept knowledge of zero-day software hardware vulnerabilities to ourselves so that we could use them for espionage, surveillance, or even battlefield preparations. And we do have a process in place called the vulnerability equities process, by which we decide whether to keep or turn over 0 days. And we should be applauded for even having a process. I always say no one in Iran is sitting around a mahogany table, debating whether to keep or turn over a 0 day to Microsoft or Apple. But what the report says is, we need to actually adhere to the criteria we lay out for whether we would keep or turn over a 0 day. How could this be used by the adversary? What would the potential blowback be? How easy is it to discover this 0 day, et cetera. And unfortunately, after a large stockpile of the United States 0 days got out and were used in a series of nation state attacks and then cyber criminal attacks, it became clear that perhaps we weren't adhering to our own standards. So the report very specifically says it's time to adhere to our own standards and be very transparent about this process, and encourage some of our international partners to develop their own VEP process and share in that. So yeah, I think we really go into the fact that we are still woefully behind when it comes to defense, certainly as a matter of foreign policy, and here are some meaty steps that we can take to improve cyber defense.
So then we have a question about, sorry, go ahead, Adam.
Well, I was just going to say, so Nicole mentioned that my role was to kind of bring all the report together, and so people would send me their comments or their responses, and if you go through the membership, you'll see that we have a number of former intelligence people in the report, and so the question touches on three tensions that, if I did my job, shouldn't be totally obvious to the people that read the report, but should be a little obvious. So the first one, as Nicole said, is the balance between offense and defense. And so there was, some tension. People, for example, when we wrote about the uses of U.S. Offensive and what effect it would have on Russian or Chinese operators, people would write to me and push back on the language that it did have an effect or it didn't have an effect, or what effect it had. Was it a tactical effect? Was it a strategic effect? And how far we wanted to go to that space. So there was a tension there. The second one was on this idea about deterrence in cyberspace. And we have like 3 paragraphs in the report because it's a kind of laying out all of the different views there. And so most people say deterrence doesn't work in cyberspace because most actions are below the threshold for use of force or an armed attack, and all this espionage still happens. But a number of people said, no, there is a type of deterrence in cyberspace from a destructive attack. Russia or China are going to be deterred for blowing something up. China might map the pipelines, as Nicole mentioned earlier, but they're not going to blow things up because they know that we'll respond. That's the second tension. The third one is, again, similar to this idea that Nicole was mentioning on the VEP. It was about what constraints we were going to put on ourselves. And here, people like Nicole and some of the others who are more focused on strategic stability and how other countries will respond, were more willing to consider more restraints because they believe that it would help predictability and stability in cyberspace. And a lot of the IC people were like, no, you're going to deny us a really important capability. So the language around what the US will or won't do is very highly crafted, because people wrote to me many times because they didn't like this word or they didn't like that word, because they said, no, of course we're going to do those types of cyber attacks. There's no way we're going to give it up. So that's a third kind of tension between, what is the US willing to do to try to try to promote these international norms, and what is it willing to do to restrain itself? And people from the ICs, not surprisingly, are not willing to do as much to restrain themselves as people outside of it.
So here's a sort of slightly different question from my colleague Frank McCrory. How is the cyber warfare facet of the Ukraine war lined up with the pre-conflict expectations and predictions? Is this typically analyzed alongside broader information warfare capabilities?
I'll start there. That is the number one question I've been getting, because actually in my book starts in Ukraine and sort of says, watch very carefully what happens in Ukraine. And then as Russia was invading, I was like waving my hands in broad gestures and saying, watch out. And, things haven't exploded yet from a cyber attack. And so some have said, oh, were you overly alarmist about this? I think, what happened when you actually look at where we have caught Russia in some of these operations, it's pretty interesting. We know that they infiltrated parts of the Ukrainian grid. We know that they made their way into some substations. We know that they were there basically with their hands on the prize, but they didn't actually shut it down. And we know that they did that in February, timed to the initial invasion. But then we saw that sort of the logic bomb was timed for April. So, when things clearly weren't going Russia's way with their special military invasion, they were willing to pull the trigger and turn the lights off and sort of punish Ukraine. And my theory on that is that if Russia believed its own faulty intelligence, that it would have its puppet government installed in Kyiv in 48 to 72 hours, why would they actually want to sabotage Ukrainian critical infrastructure? But they clearly had a foothold. The other interesting thing that happened is actually maybe a little bit of room for optimism. And I've become a little bit more of an optimist as this invasion has continued. But they installed wiper malware at a number of Ukrainian banks and government agencies, and it was picked up really quickly by this coalition of, the Ukrainian CERT, but also, in conjunction with American intelligence, Western intelligence, and private companies. Microsoft was among the first to kind of raise the flag about this wiper malware and make sure that they can mitigate it in allied countries like Poland. And then there was the hack of Viasat, which is this internet satellite broadband provider. And it was clear that the goal was to disrupt people's connections to the internet. And, there we got a wild card in Elon Musk, who ended up providing Starlink servers to Ukraine. And there's a fascinating, funny story there, by the way, which is, we don't have much time for it, but just there is a Silicon Valley CEO who's Ukrainian, who went to college with Zelensky, got a phone call from Zelensky in the first days of the war, who said, we have 5 internet links in and out of Ukraine, and we expect Russia will bomb them all. Can you help? And so the CEO called Mark Andreessen, and he said, do you know Elon? Can you help? Mark called Elon, laid this all out. And apparently Elon said something, I don't have the exact quote, but something like, oh, handicapping an authoritarian dictator, that's on my bucket list. And commenced this amazing operation to send these Starlink servers into Ukraine, which is the whole reason we continue to see these incredible images of what Russian soldiers were doing on the ground. And so, at every step we've sort of mitigated. And then, most sort of disturbing of all was this discovery of this tool that the intelligence community is calling Pipe Dream, which is what they're calling a Swiss Army knife of critical infrastructure hacking tools. And they haven't officially attributed it, but most theorize that it's a Russian tool designed to hack pipelines. And the astounding thing there is that they were able to catch it in development before it was even deployed. And the other astounding thing, as a reporter watching this, reporter at heart now, I guess I have to say, is that they declassified it, which is huge. And so, we know that Russia has basically deployed, some of the worst kind of attacks that we've seen, at least to date, and that perhaps they have an additional capability. But, I think what we're seeing is that the private public sector are not letting a good crisis go to waste. And they're really partnering at a scale and speed that I have not seen until this invasion, and hopefully becomes a model for what we do going forward.
And it also helps that I think Ukraine had a very good technology talent pool. They are, I don't know how many of the world software companies actually have a lot of people there, and there's quite a few of them. We have a few more questions, so let's try and get through the last few fairly quickly. Is the National Institute of Science, the Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework strong enough for critical infrastructure? Are you familiar with that? And so the NIST, are we?
You want to take that, Nicole?
I think the NIST standards are great. It's just a matter of how you actually get people to implement them. So, one sort of brilliant thing that I think this administration has done is that in the Biden executive order, the cyber executive order, it is the most comprehensive policy document we have seen on cyber coming from any administration. And what it does is it says, okay, we can't force critical infrastructure operators to abide by these NIST cybersecurity standards. So who do we have control over? Well, we have control over federal agencies. So from now on, federal agencies must meet these NIST standards. Well, who else do we have control over? Not many, actually, it turns out. But contractors. We do have the power of the purse when it comes to federal contractors. And so what the cyber executive order did is it said, hey, we'll even cut out the red tape for you. We'll let you self-certify that you meet these NIST standards. But if we catch you lying to us, which is likely because you'll probably get hit by a ransomware attack and the forensics will show that you didn't have multi-factor authentication turned on, you are banned from ever doing business with the federal government again. That is the first real stick we've seen in this space as a matter of policy. And I think everyone would do well to read that cyber executive order, because I do believe it's a template for what will come to the rest of the critical infrastructure sector. But no, we have a long way to go. And if you want to know how woefully vulnerable the United States is in terms of our critical infrastructure to cyber attacks, all you have to do is call up Colonial Pipeline where, a bumbling group of cyber criminals were able to essentially rent ransomware to hijack Colonial Pipeline's business network and force them to preemptively shut down the pipeline, biggest conduit for gas, jet fuel, and diesel to the Eastern Seaboard. And how were they able to do it? They were able to do it because Colonial Pipeline forgot to deactivate an old employee account. That employee reused a bad password, and they never had multi-factor authentication switched on. And that is sort of, unfortunately, the sorry state of America's critical infrastructure cybersecurity right now. So, I think there's a lot of good work being done on, how do we incentivize these companies to really take this seriously. And I think, again, Ukraine has been, a big boost. And I also think ransomware. Every board is now asking about ransomware. So I like to say ransomware is actually pen testing the United States and showing every company, where they're vulnerable. And 10 years ago, a lot of these companies would hide or cover up the fact that they had been hacked by a Chinese APT group and that their intellectual property was stolen. But those were quiet attacks. And ransomware are very loud. It's hard to hide a ransomware attack. And oh, by the way, these groups don't just hold your data hostage, they actually threaten to leak it online. So it's harder to hide a ransomware attack. So finally, these companies are doing much more when it comes to limiting their attack surface than they were 3 years ago even.
So let me just combine two questions here. How do we deal with bad state actors and misinformation when commercial interests use sort of the same strategies? But the second, and then what is this big stick we're talking about in terms of cyber deterrence? So Adam, you want to take one and Nicole the other?
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of activities to do towards nation state misinformation. A lot of it has to do about, education, getting on the same page as the tech firms about takedowns and information sharing. I think all of the kind of things that we've been doing, but there's not a huge amount, I think, on the counter narratives. I mean, there are things, but I don't think there's a lot we can do on the foreign state actors. I think the big stick is, there isn't really a big stick. There's a series of little sticks that maybe we can bundle together to make a bigger stick. And they are the things that we have been talking about, a combination of US offensive actions, sanctions and other types of punitive actions to diplomatically, some attempts to get others to do the same thing, and better defense. That's what I think the response is.
Nicole, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, the report is a little bit vague about, I think, I'm looking at one recommendation where we say the United States could also reserve the right to take action against infrastructure used by these groups if the countries hosting it will not do so. So it could be, operations like what Cyber Command did to TrickBot, which was this bot network that had been used for ransomware attacks ahead of the 2020 election, when it essentially took them offline and enforced them to scatter, and then later they regrouped. Or it could be something as serious as a grid attack, but we don't specify that in the report. And I think it would be weird almost if we did. It's more like use your imagination.
Okay. Adam, I'm going to give you the last word. Now that you've authored this report with this wonderful independent task force, what's the optimistic scenario? Because Nicole started with words that any academic doesn't like. We don't want this report to be just academic, what's the best case scenario? What's the best outcome you can hope for? What is the impact that you would like this report to have?
I actually think the biggest impact is most likely to be on the things we haven't really talked that much about, is on the domestic side, in particular, that the role that the State Department and Foreign Service officers in the future are going to play in this space. I mean, it was a nice coincidence, but the chair of the task force was nominated to be the new U.S. ambassador to cyberspace, Nate Fick. Who's I think is being voted on tomorrow, I think, actually. So he will be the first ambassador. They've created a new department, a bureau in the State Department, and so State Department will have a new voice in the interagency. Will be able to better represent U.S. interests. One of the things we recommend is that, much like on the military side, you have to have, experience with joint operations to continue being promoted in your career. The same should be true for digital and cyber issues. You should always have some experience as a foreign service officer. I think those types of things are probably have more long-term effect, and the policies we're talking about are things that, in many ways people have been talking about for a long time on the deterrence and other side.
I think that those are really important parting words, because it's these institutional changes that have permanent effects, and we certainly see this in a lot of sort of governmental environments, which is you really have to create the positions and the line items and the budgets to support these kinds of work so that these issues continue to be focused on. I think one of the things we spend a lot of time talking at the business school about is sort of how the world is changing, and I think sometimes we forget sort of how much sort of the level, sort of the different kinds of competencies we need in many of these positions. So I love to see these new positions like the National Cyber Director and now a Cyber Ambassador. With that, let me thank Adam and Nicole. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your wonderful insights with us. I once again want to thank the Beal Family Foundation and KPMG for supporting this series.